Every tick hides a lie, and tonight, one clock may betray a killer. Welcome to Echoes of Clues. I am your host, Shadow Teller. Tell me where you're listening from below. Your voices matter. Let's begin. At precisely 3:30, the clock in the hall of Alderwick House gave a small, uncertain cough before striking the hour. Those who knew it well, chiefly Mrs. Pemberton, who dusted it every Thursday, and Miss Marple, who had once remarked that it was a little fast when flustered, might have noticed that the sound was not quite right. The third chime lingered, as though thinking better of itself. The fourth came too quickly, and the fifth did not come at all, but no one was listening very carefully. Alderwick House, a respectable Georgian building with ambitions beyond its means, was hosting the village's annual Spring Benevolence Tea. This was the sort of event that occurred with comforting regularity in Alderwick-on-Wold, and which permitted the inhabitants to congratulate themselves on being both charitable and civilized. There were cucumber sandwiches cut too thick, sponge cake with too much jam, and the low, earnest hum of conversation that suggested kindness while actively avoiding it. Miss Jane Marple sat slightly apart from the main cluster of guests, her hands folded neatly over a small plate that held one untouched biscuit. She wore a pale lavender cardigan that had seen many such afternoons and had learned not to expect surprises. From her position near the window, she could observe nearly everyone without appearing to do so, a skill acquired through years of village life and mistaken by most for frailty. "Such a pity about the weather," said Mrs. Lionel Briggs, who was not looking at the sky but at Mrs. Raymond Fletcher's hat. "Quite," replied Mrs. Fletcher stiffly, adjusting the offending brim, which was both wider and newer than propriety required. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes flickered between them, registering the tension with the same quiet interest she might have given to a dropped stitch. At the center of the room, presiding with benevolent authority, was Mr. Harold Wickham, owner of Alderwick House and principal benefactor of the tea. He was a man in his late 60s, silver-haired, upright, and immaculately turned out, with a sort of smile that suggested he had never raised his voice and never needed to. His generosity was widely admired, his character less frequently examined. "You must all try the lemon sponge," he was saying, hands clasped behind his back. "My late wife's recipe. She insisted it was best eaten before 4. A curious remark, Miss Marple thought, though she would not have been able to say why at that precise moment. Near the mantelpiece stood Inspector Thomas Grant, conspicuous in plain clothes and visibly uncomfortable without a uniform. He had been invited under the pretense of village goodwill and accepted because refusing would have caused more comment than attendance. He was engaged in polite conversation with Dr. Eleanor Finch, whose calm demeanor and sensible shoes gave her an air of unassailable reason. "You'll find nothing amiss here," Dr. Finch was saying lightly. "Alderwick thrives on routine." Inspector Grant smiled in a way that suggested he had heard this sentiment before, usually shortly before routine collapsed entirely. The tea proceeded. Cups were refilled. Compliments were paid and deflected. A plate of sandwiches was dropped and mourned. And all the while, the clock in the hall ticked on, its pendulum steady, its face serene, its inner workings, unknown to all but one, slightly compromised. At 3:47, Mr. Wickham excused himself. "If you'll pardon me," he said, pressing a hand briefly to his chest, "I find I've left some papers in my study. Age is a tiresome thing." There were murmurs of sympathy. Mrs. Pemberton offered to fetch them for him, but he waved her away with a genial laugh. "Nonsense! I know where everything is, at least for now." Miss Marple watched him go, her head tilted slightly, as though listening to something very far away. The study lay at the end of the west corridor, a room seldom entered by anyone else. But it was said to be full of ledgers and correspondence, of neatly stacked files and a locked drawer that no one could quite account for. The door closed behind Mr. Wickham with a soft, final sound. The tea continued. At 4 o'clock precisely, according to the clock in the hall, Mrs. Pemberton rose to suggest a second round of cake. She paused mid-sentence. "Mr. Wickham?" she called, a polite query more than a concern. There was no answer. A few minutes passed. Someone laughed a little too loudly. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Fletcher had stopped fanning herself. Inspector Grant frowned, checking his watch. "I'll see if he requires assistance," Dr. Finch said, already moving toward the corridor. She did not scream when she opened the study door. Dr. Finch was not the screaming sort. But she did step back very quickly, with one hand pressed to her mouth, her face draining of color in a manner that suggested something profoundly wrong. Inspector Grant was beside her at once. Mr. Harold Wickham lay slumped over his desk, one hand still clutching a folded sheet of paper. His expression was not one of pain, but of surprise, mild, almost puzzled, as though he had been interrupted mid-thought. The clock in the study had stopped. Later, many would insist they had known at once that something dreadful had happened, that there had been a feeling, a hush, a sense of inevitability. Miss Marple, who remained seated by the window, did not claim such foresight. She merely observed that when Mrs. Pemberton's teacup shattered on the floor, no one noticed the sound it made, because everyone was listening without quite knowing it, to the silence where the clock's ticking should have been. And in that silence, the lies had already begun to whisper. Inspector Grant moved into the study with the careful economy of a man who had learned, through long experience, that the room itself could become evidence. He did not touch the body. He did not touch the paper. He simply looked first at Mr. Wickham's posture, then at the desk, then at the way the lamplight caught the edge of a toppled inkstand that had not spilled. Dr. Finch followed him in, swallowing once, her composure held together by habit rather than courage. "He's gone," she said quietly, as if speaking too loudly might make it worse. "But we must still be sure." Grant nodded. "Yes, of course." Behind them the doorway filled with anxious faces. Mrs. Pemberton, with both hands clenched in her apron, Mrs. Fletcher, pale and very upright, Mrs. Briggs peering as though she might spot scandal on the carpet, and a thin young woman in a plain dress who looked as if she had been trying not to be noticed all afternoon. Miss Lily Hart, the companion or secretary, or whatever arrangement Mr. Wickham preferred to describe her as when the village asked. "We must have air," Dr. Finch said abruptly. She crossed to the tall window and pushed it open. Cool April wind slipped in, carrying the scent of damp earth and cut grass. It did not belong in a room that smelled of paper, polish, and something faintly medicinal. Grant watched her kneel beside the desk. She placed 2 fingers lightly on Mr. Wickham's neck, waited, then shifted to his wrist. Her face did not change much, only the slightest tightening around the eyes. "No pulse," she said, standing. "He's dead. Quite dead." A small moan came from somewhere behind the threshold. Mrs. Pemberton's voice trembled. "But he was just here. He spoke to us not 20 minutes ago." Grant glanced at his watch again, out of reflex. What time was it when he left the drawing room? There was a brief confusion. People in shock were always certain of minutes until asked to supply them. "At 3:47, Dr. Finch said, before anyone else could guess. "I remember because I just looked at the clock in the hall and thought how odd it was that it struck the hour wrong." Several eyes turned toward her. The remark was too specific to be accidental. "The hall clock?" Grant repeated. "What was wrong with it?" Dr. Finch hesitated. "It missed a chime, or sounded as if it did." She gave a little shake of her head, impatient with herself. "That can't matter. Clocks misbehave." Grant said nothing, but his gaze drifted to the mantel-shelf. The small clock there, the one in the study, sat with its hands frozen at 2 minutes past 4. Its glass face reflected the open window, the pale sky, and the black line of the pendulum at rest. It was a handsome piece. the sort of clock a man might stop deliberately if he wished to argue later about time. "Everyone will return to the drawing room," Grant said. His tone was firm now, the official note coming through. "No one leaves the house. Mrs. Pemberton, please see that the front door is watched." Mrs. Pemberton blinked. "Watched?" Grant met her eye. "Until we know what happened, madam. This is no longer a social occasion." There was a soft stir, shock turning quickly into something else. Curiosity. The village's first instinct in any disruption was to gather. Its second was to arrange a story. Dr. Finch drew Grant a step aside. Her voice lowered. "Thomas, if you don't mind, this is not natural, is it?" Grant did not answer at once. He leaned forward slightly, peering at Mr. Wickham's face. There was no froth, no blood, no visible injury. The man looked as though he had bowed his head to read and simply decided not to lift it again. "We'll know more when the constable arrives," he said at last. "But, no, it doesn't feel natural." He allowed himself then to look at the paper in the dead man's hand. He did not touch it yet, but he could see the top corner, creamy stationery, the faint impression of a crest, the start of a line of handwriting. A letter, then, a message, or the kind of thing that could kill a man without laying a finger on him. "Grant!" Mrs. Briggs whispered sharply from the doorway, as though drama required secrecy. You don't think it was his heart, do you? Poor Mr. Wickham always seemed so robust." "Please," Grant said, and his eyes flicked briefly over the faces. "Drawing room, now." They obeyed, reluctantly. People were very obedient when told to do something they intended to do anyway. Only Lily Hart lingered. She stood just beyond the threshold, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles shone. She did not look at Mr. Wickham. She looked at the desk, at the scattered papers, at the locked cabinet in the corner as if it might open and accuse her. Grant watched her. "Miss Hart?" She started as though she had forgotten he was there. "Yes, Inspector." "You worked for Mr. Wickham." Her mouth tightened. "I assisted him, with correspondence, arrangements. You were in the drawing room during the tea?" "Yes, of course." Grant's tone remained mild. "You didn't follow him here?" "A beat too long." "No." Dr. Finch, still near the open window, took a breath. "Lily, go and sit down. You're white as linen." Lily's eyes flickered to Dr. Finch with something like gratitude or resentment. "I'm all right," she said, but her voice wavered. She went, finally, closing the door behind her with careful hands. Grant exhaled slowly. "She's frightened," he said. "Everyone is frightened," Dr. Finch replied. Then, after a moment, "Though not for the same reasons." Grant looked at her, startled by the sharpness. Dr. Finch was not a woman given to insinuation. "You suspect something," he said. "I suspect human beings," she answered, with sudden grimness. "Which is usually enough." In the drawing room, the guests had arranged themselves as if instinctively seeking allies. Mrs. Fletcher sat very straight on the edge of a chair, her hands folded as though praying not to be implicated. Mrs. Briggs had stationed herself near the fireplace, a place that suggested authority and warmth. Mrs. Pemberton hovered near the door, wringing her apron as if she might wring truth from it. Miss Marple remained where she had been all along, by the window, the lavender cardigan unruffled, her small plate still holding its untouched biscuit. The only sign of disturbance was that she had placed her knitting aside and now held her hands folded neatly in her lap. When Inspector Grant entered, the conversation ceased with the abruptness of a candle snuffed out. "I've sent for assistance," he said. "Until then, I need to ask a few questions. No one leaves the premises." Mrs. Briggs's eyes widened, the thrill of scandal overcoming her fear. "Inspector, surely you don't mean—" "I mean," Grant said evenly, "that Mr. Harold Wickham did not die in a manner that permits assumptions." a collective intake of breath, part outrage, part excitement. Miss Marple's gaze lowered briefly to the carpet, where the fallen crumbs of cake looked oddly like scattered clues. "Dr. Finch," Grant said, "will you tell them your estimate of time?" Dr. Finch cleared her throat. "He was alive when he left the room at 3:47. He was dead when I found him a few minutes past 4. The study clock is stopped at 2 minutes past 4. But that may mean nothing." Mrs. Pemberton pressed a trembling hand to her chest, but he said he was going for papers. He would have come right back. "And he didn't," Grant said. "So we must consider what happened in that corridor and in that room." Mrs. Fletcher's voice came out thin. "Could someone have gone in after him?" "Could they?" Grant asked, and looked around, letting the silence do the work. Miss Marple spoke then, softly, almost as if she were commenting on the tea rather than a death. "It is curious," she said, "how people do move about without being noticed when everyone is convinced they are not the sort to cause a disturbance." Several heads turned. Her tone was gentle, and because it was gentle, it slipped under their defenses. Inspector Grant's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in the dawning awareness that the old lady by the window was watching a different story than everyone else. "What did you observe, Miss Marple?" he asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly, apologetic as ever. "Oh, nothing of consequence, I'm sure. Only that Mr. Wickham held something in his pocket when he stood up, and he seemed preoccupied, and that the hall clock had a most peculiar way of striking the hour." She paused, as though searching for the right comparison. "It reminded me," she added, "of a man I once knew in St. Mary Mead who always coughed before telling a lie." Inspector Grant's expression, already set into the practical mask of his profession, shifted almost imperceptibly at Miss Marple's remark. It was not amusement, it was recognition of a mind that observed not objects, but the small betrayals people made without realizing they were betraying themselves. "A cough before telling a lie," Mrs. Briggs repeated, as though tasting the phrase. "Really, Miss Marple, this is hardly the time for—" "Oh, but it is always the time," Miss Marple said mildly. "One learns in villages that when something dreadful happens, everyone suddenly becomes very certain of what they did not see." Her voice remained gentle. The effect was not to silence the room so much as to make its occupants faintly uneasy, like children who have been praised in a tone that suggests the praise is undeserved. Grant moved nearer the window, not quite joining Miss Marple, but placing himself within hearing, as though he wished to encourage her without appearing to. "You said Mr. Wickham had something in his pocket?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "A paper, I think. Or perhaps an envelope." He patted it just once, as if to reassure himself it was there. Mrs. Pemberton's eyes widened. "He did have a letter. I saw him reading something earlier, just before the tea began. He frowned, but then he smiled when I approached and said it was nothing of consequence." "Did you see the sender?" Grant asked. Mrs. Pemberton shook her head miserably. "No, Inspector. He folded it up at once." Dr. Finch's gaze went toward Lily Hart, who sat rigidly on a settee, hands clasped in her lap, staring fixedly at the rug as though it might offer instructions. "Lily," she said, gentler than before, "did you bring Mr. Wickham any letters today?" Lily's head lifted quickly. "No, the post came this morning. I sorted it with Mrs. Pemberton's help. There was nothing unusual." Grant noted the speed of the answer, and people told the truth more slowly. They had to find it first. "Was there any private correspondence?" he asked. Lily's lips tightened. "Mr. Wickham received letters, of course. From solicitors, from charities. He was a man of business." "And from anyone else?" Grant pressed. Lily's cheeks flared. "I don't open his personal letters." Mrs. Briggs made a small sound of approval at that, as though discretion were the same thing as innocence. Grant let it rest, but only because he knew better than to hammer too soon. He turned to Mrs. Fletcher. You were seated near the door. Did you see anyone leave after Mr. Wickham?" Mrs. Fletcher's eyes flickered, offended at being questioned. "No one left at all. We were all here." Dr. Finch said quietly, "That isn't quite true." Mrs. Fletcher snapped her head toward her. What do you mean?" "You went into the hall," Dr. Finch said, "after Mr. Wickham left. You said you needed your smelling salts." Mrs. Fletcher's nostrils flared. "That was hardly leaving. I was gone less than a minute." Grant's gaze sharpened. "At what time?" Mrs. Fletcher opened her mouth, then hesitated. Just after he left. Perhaps 3:50. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the mantel clock in the drawing room. It ticked sturdily, unembarrassed by scrutiny, as though it had nothing to hide. "The hall clock was striking oddly," she murmured. "So time may be persuasive rather than accurate." Grant looked at her. "Persuasive?" "It is remarkable," Miss Marple said, "how a clock can persuade people to remember events in a convenient order." No one replied. Even Mrs. Briggs seemed to sense that the old lady's mildness concealed something precise. Grant turned to Mrs. Briggs instead. "Mrs. Briggs, did you leave your seat?" Mrs. Briggs lifted her chin. "Certainly not. I was speaking with Reverend Sloane about the raffle prizes. I can't imagine why anyone would suggest—" "And you, Mrs. Pemberton?" Grant asked. Mrs. Pemberton wrung her apron again. I went to the kitchen for more hot water, but I came right back. Miss Marple saw me." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, and you spilled a little on the tray, dear. You were very flustered." Mrs. Pemberton flushed, grateful and humiliated all at once. Grant had the uneasy feeling that his questions were opening drawers in people's minds, drawers they had kept locked for years. He needed facts, not outrage. He needed the corridor. "I'm going to look at the West Hall," he said. "Dr. Finch, would you come with me?" Dr. Finch rose at once. Lily Hart made a small movement as if to follow, then thought better and sat rigidly again. Miss Marple spoke softly, almost to herself. "The West Hall has a runner carpet, does it not? With little roses along the edge." Mrs. Pemberton nodded automatically. "Yes, miss." "They are always slightly worn where people pause near the side table," Miss Marple continued, "because everyone pretends not to pause, and yet they always do. To glance at the mirror, to adjust a glove, to hide an expression." Grant paused at the door. "You think someone paused?" Miss Marple smiled, faintly apologetic. "I only think people are very rarely as direct as they like to appear." In the corridor, the air was cooler, and the sounds of the drawing room faded behind the closed door, leaving the house's deeper quiet. The distant clink of a kettle, the whisper of a draught around old woodwork. The hall clock stood between them and the study, its polished case reflecting a narrow slice of their faces. Two serious figures in a genteel setting that suddenly felt like a stage. Grant leaned toward it. The pendulum swung steadily now, as if nothing had happened. The hands pointed to 10 minutes past 4, but his own watch said 4:17. He frowned. "It's fast." "It always is," Mrs. Pemberton called faintly from behind the door, as though the house itself were listening. "Mr. Wickham liked it that way. Said it kept people punctual." Dr. Finch's eyes narrowed. "Or rushed." Grant examined the clock more closely. But there were faint scratches near the latch of the glass door, as though it had been opened often, perhaps too often for a purely decorative piece. He did not touch it yet. He merely noted. They moved down the corridor. The runner carpet was indeed patterned with small roses, faded slightly along the center path. Near a narrow side table, on which rested a silver tray and a vase of wilting daffodils, there was a darker mark, not quite a stain, but a disturbance. The nap of the carpet brushed the wrong way, as though someone had turned quickly. Grant crouched, running a finger just above it, careful not to press. "Someone stood here recently." Dr. Finch leaned closer. Could be any of them. Could be, Grant said, but not if they swear they didn't leave the room. He rose, and they continued to the study door. It was shut but not locked. Grant tried the handle and opened it a fraction. Inside, the scene was unchanged. Mr. Wickham still lay over the desk, one hand clutching the paper. The open window made the curtains stir faintly like a breath. Grant stepped in, holding the door open for Dr. Finch. The first thing he did was look again at the study clock. Its hands still read 2 minutes past 4. "That clock is stopped deliberately," he said quietly. Dr. Finch nodded, her face tight. "Yes." Grant approached the desk, and now, with the care of a man handling not just objects but consequences, he eased the paper from Mr. Wickham's fingers. The grip was stiff, but not impossible. Whoever had died here had wanted to keep the message close. The paper unfolded with a soft crackle. There were only a few lines. Neat handwriting. Controlled. Almost polite. "Doctor," Finch read over his shoulder. Her breath caught, not at fear, but at recognition. "What does it say?" Grant asked, though he could see it plainly enough. Dr. Finch's voice came out low. "It's an accusation." Grant's eyes moved over the words again, weighing them like stones. "I know what you did to Edmund Carroway, and I know what you did with the will. Meet me alone at 4 o'clock. If you do not, I shall speak." Grant folded the letter slowly, as though the air itself might snatch it. "Edmund Carroway," he said. "Who's that?" Dr. Finch's face had gone very still. "A man who died here 10 years ago," she said, "in what the village called an accident." Outside the study, somewhere down the corridor, the hall clock gave a steady, confident tick, as though it had never missed a beat in its life. And Inspector Grant slipped the letter into his notebook without ceremony, but the careful way he closed the cover suggested he had just placed something volatile behind a thin wall. 10 years ago, he repeated, turning the phrase over as though it might reveal a hidden edge. "An accident here at Alderwick House." Dr. Finch nodded once. "Edmund Carroway was Mr. Wickham's nephew by marriage, his late wife's sister's boy. He came to stay for a summer. There was talk of reforming him, talk of giving him purpose." Her mouth tightened. "Then he fell from the orchard wall and broke his neck." "People do fall," Grant said. "They do," Dr. Finch agreed. "But this village has never been entirely satisfied with the way he fell." Grant glanced at the dead man again, at the mild surprise fixed on his face. There were deaths that looked like endings. This looked like an interruption. "Who knew about that accident?" he asked. "Everyone," Dr. Finch replied. "And no one. It was spoken of for a season, then folded away like a winter coat. But the name, Carroway, still has a way of making people's voices go careful." Grant took a slow breath. "Then the writer of this letter wanted Mr. Wickham alone at 4 o'clock. "Yes," said Dr. Finch, "and he went. Or thought he went." Grant's eyes went again to the study clock stopped at 2 minutes past 4, then to his own watch, still running, still insisting on its version of truth. The stopped clock made a neat little story. The hall clock, fast, persuasive, made another. He moved to the mantel and examined the study clock properly this time. Its face was clean, the hands had not simply drifted to a stop. The pendulum had been arrested, gently, and by someone who knew how to do it without leaving obvious damage. It was the sort of action performed not in panic, but with intent. "Someone wanted the time to be 4:02, he said. Dr. Finch's eyes sharpened. "Or wanted it to look as if it was." Grant returned to the doorway and called down the corridor. "Mrs. Pemberton." The housekeeper arrived quickly, breathless with worry and indignation. "Yes, Inspector." "Who has keys to this study?" Mrs. Pemberton blinked. "Keys? Well, Mr. Wickham had his own, of course, and I keep a spare. For cleaning. Anyone else?" She hesitated as though honesty were a form of betrayal. Miss Hart sometimes, when he asked her to file things. But she never— "Does the door lock from the outside?" "No," Mrs. Pemberton said at once. "Only from within, if you turn the bolt." Grant filed that away. "And the hall clock," he said. "Who winds it?" Mrs. Pemberton looked momentarily affronted. "I do, every Thursday." "And does anyone else open its case?" "No one has any reason to," she said, then faltered. "Except Mr. Wickham. He liked to adjust it." "Adjust it how?" Mrs. Pemberton's eyes slid away. "If it was slow." Grant's gaze held hers. "It isn't slow." "No," she admitted reluctantly. "It's fast. He said it was better. People were always late otherwise." Grant nodded, already turning back toward the drawing room. "Dr. Finch, stay with him," he said, meaning the body. "I want everyone together again, and I want to know who, exactly, would care about a will." In the drawing room, the atmosphere had soured. Teacups stood half-finished, their polite warmth gone cold. The guests sat like jurors forced into proximity. Even Mrs. Briggs, and who ordinarily thrived on tremor and speculation, looked unsettled by the way officialdom had entered their parlor. When Grant walked in, they all tried to read his face and failed. "Mr. Wickham was summoned to his study," Grant said, and several people flinched at the word "summoned" by a letter. That letter refers to a man named Edmund Carraway and to a will. The reaction was immediate and, to Miss Marple's quiet satisfaction, thoroughly human. Mrs. Fletcher's hands tightened around her handbag as though it might serve as a shield. Mrs. Briggs made a small, involuntary sound, half gasp, half triumph, because the mention of a scandal resurrected was irresistible. Lily Hart's face went so pale that the freckles across her nose stood out like flecks of dust. Dr. Finch, who had returned a moment before, watched Lily closely. "Edmund Carraway," Mrs. Briggs breathed. "Well, I never thought we'd hear that name again." "You have," Grant said calmly. "So you did know him." "Of course I knew of him," Mrs. Briggs corrected hastily, reclaiming respectability. "A dreadful business. He was not steady." Mrs. Fletcher's voice came out thin. "He was a troubled young man. There were rumors about drink. And about money," Mrs. Briggs added too quickly. Grant's eyes moved from face to face. "Was there a will in his case?" There was a pause long enough to be meaningful. Mrs. Pemberton spoke and her voice shook. "Mr. Carraway was meant to inherit something, I believe. Mrs. Wickham wanted it, but then, after he died, Mr. Wickham kept the estate as it was. And he said it was because there was no proper document," Mrs. Fletcher snapped, almost as though defending a judgment made a decade ago. "I remember it perfectly. There was a solicitor involved. Everything was legal." Miss Marple's gaze rested gently on Mrs. Fletcher's mouth. The woman was speaking too much, too fast, as though words could barricade the past. "Which solicitor?" Grant asked. Mrs. Fletcher's eyes darted. "Mr. Chislehurst in Market Woldham, or perhaps it was his clerk." "And you're certain the will did not exist?" Mrs. Fletcher lifted her chin. "Absolutely," Miss Marple said softly. "How very fortunate for Mr. Wickham." Mrs. Fletcher swung toward her, bristling. "Miss Marple, really, Mr. Wickham was a generous man." "Many generous men," Miss Marple replied gently, "are generous with what they have kept." Grant watched that exchange with an inward note of caution. Miss Marple spoke as if she were discussing jam, yet her words slipped under ribs. The front bell rang then, sharp, decisive, wholly modern against the old house's hush. Mrs. Pemberton nearly jumped. "A constable," Grant said. "Good." A moment later, Constable Price arrived, hat in hand, cheeks ruddy from haste and the cold. He looked scandalized by the grandeur of Alderwick House and doubly scandalized by death in such a place. Grant took him aside, murmured instructions, then returned to face the room. "Until we've examined the study properly, I need the house staff separated from the guests," he said. Mrs. Pemberton, Lily Hart, anyone else employed here, please go to the morning room. The rest of you remain." Lily rose unsteadily. "Inspector, may I fetch my things?" "No," Grant said, mild but unyielding. "Not yet." She swallowed, nodding too quickly, and followed Mrs. and Pemberton out. As she passed Miss Marple, her eyes flicked up, briefly, desperately, then away again, as though she feared that Miss Marple might already know what she had done, or what she had not done but wished she had. When the door closed, Mrs. Briggs leaned forward. "Inspector, surely you don't mean to suggest that Lily—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Grant said. "Not yet." He moved to the mantel and took the drawing-room clock in his hand, tilting it to see the back. It was an ordinary piece, wound with a small key. Nothing remarkable. He set it down again. "Now," he said, "I want each of you to tell me, precisely and in order, what you did between 3:47, when Mr. Wickham left this room, and 4 o'clock. Mrs. Briggs opened her mouth at once. "Not all together," Grant added. "One at a time." He chose Mrs. Fletcher first, perhaps because she looked the least likely to crumble, and therefore the most likely to reveal cracks. Mrs. Fletcher began briskly, describing her discomfort, her need for smelling salts, her short trip into the hall. She insisted it had been mere seconds. She insisted she had seen no one. She insisted with a kind of brittle defiance that her movements were irrelevant. Grant listened without interruption. Yet as she spoke, his attention was caught by a small detail, not in her words, but in her hands. She was twisting her glove, only one glove, the right, over and over, as though it were damp. And the glove, Miss Marple noticed, was a shade darker than its mate. A damp glove, Miss Marple thought, in a house full of polished wood and dry air. And in her mind, without any effort at all, the image of the open study window arose, curtains stirring, April wind coming in. A person could have washed something quickly at the side table, perhaps, where the silver tray sat, or dabbed at a stain, or cooled hot fingers. Miss Marple remained silent. It would not do to hurry things. People, like clocks, revealed their true nature when allowed to run on. Inspector Grant turned to the next person, and the hall clock down the corridor ticked confidently, fast, persuasive, and entirely unbothered by the fact that it might be whispering lies. Inspector Grant took his time, as though he were letting each person's story settle like silt in water. He asked for facts, but he listened for rhythm, the places where a sentence stumbled, where a memory was polished too brightly, where an answer came a fraction too ready. Mrs. Briggs went next, her voice eager despite the seriousness she attempted to drape over it. "I stayed exactly where I was," she declared, "by the fireplace. Reverend Sloane can attest. Though he stepped out briefly, poor man, to take a call. His sister has been unwell." "Reverend Sloane left the room?" Grant cut in. Mrs. Briggs blinked. "Only for a moment. He said it was urgent." "And you remained in here while he was gone?" "Certainly. I was speaking to Mrs. Pritchard about the raffle hamper, and then to Dr. Finch about Mrs. Wickham's lemon sponge, I believe." Dr. Finch's face remained neutral. "You spoke to me, yes, about cake." Grant nodded as if cake were relevant. "Mrs. Pemberton went to the kitchen," he said. "Yes, but she came back," Mrs. Briggs said, with the faint edge of someone who enjoyed noting the staff's comings and goings. "Oh, and Miss Hart never left the settee. She sat like a statue. Poor thing. She always was, rather submissive." Grant made no comment. His gaze traveled to the door leading into the hall, then back to Mrs. Briggs's flushed, pleased face. "And Mrs. Pritchard?" he asked, a timid voice from a corner. I was in the cloakroom," said Mrs. Pritchard, a grey little woman with anxious eyes. "For a moment. I needed my drops. The air in here is very close." Grant glanced at Dr. Finch. Dr. Finch's lips pressed together. Close air was the cloakroom's usual alibi. "Did you meet anyone in the hall?" Grant asked. "No," Mrs. Pritchard said quickly. "No one. Only the clock." "The clock," Grant repeated. "It struck," Mrs. Pritchard said, and her voice lowered as if she were confessing superstition. "But it sounded wrong, like it forgot itself." Miss Marple's eyes softened. Mrs. Pritchard was not imaginative. When such a woman spoke of a clock forgetting itself, it meant she had truly heard something odd. Grant took down another note. "Mrs. Pritchard, what time did you go into the cloakroom?" Mrs. Pritchard frowned. "Just before 4, I think. Or perhaps just after. Inspector, I'm not certain. The hall clock is fast," Grant finished, and his tone remained level, but there was now an edge beneath it, the point of a needle. "We'll establish time by my watch and the constable's, not by Mr. Wickham's preferences." He turned then to Mrs. Fletcher again. "You said you went into the hall for smelling salts and returned within a minute." "Yes," Mrs. Fletcher said stiffly. Grant's gaze fell, quietly, deliberately, on the glove she still held. Your glove is damp." Mrs. Fletcher stared at him as though he had accused her of murder outright. "Damp? Nonsense." "It's darker," Grant said, "and you're twisting it as if to dry it." Color rose in her face. "I spilled tea earlier on the saucer." "Tea dries," Grant said, still mild. Mrs. Fletcher's eyes flickered toward the hall door. "Perhaps I washed my fingers. There is a basin in the cloakroom." "You said you did not go to the cloakroom." "I said I went into the hall," Mrs. Fletcher snapped. "That includes the Dr. Finch cut in quietly. "The cloakroom is down the east passage, Mrs. Fletcher. You would not call it the hall unless you wished to be vague." A brittle silence fell. Mrs. Fletcher's mouth opened and closed again. She looked, for the first time, genuinely frightened. Not because she was caught in a lie, but because she had been forced to admit she was capable of lying. Miss Marple watched her with the detached sympathy one gave to a person on the ledge. "There is a side table in the West Hall," Mrs. Fletcher said finally in a thin voice, "with a bowl of water for flowers. I dipped my fingers there. My hands felt sticky. Is that a crime now?" "It might be," Grant said, and let the words hang just long enough to sting. He turned away before she could rally. "Now," he said, "Reverend Sloane." Reverend Sloane had returned to the room at some point and sat with his hat on his knees, his clerical collar slightly askew as though he had dressed in haste. He looked exhausted rather than guilty, which did not necessarily mean he was either. "I did step out," he admitted, voice low. "I received a call from my sister's caretaker. She's taken a turn. I didn't wish to disturb everyone." "Which door did you use?" Grant asked. "The one into the front hall," the Reverend said. "I stood by the telephone table. I could see the passage to the west corridor, but Inspector, I wasn't watching it. I was listening." "Did you see anyone pass?" Grant asked. Reverend Sloane hesitated. "I saw someone's back, I think. A figure moving away toward the west hall. But it was quick. I assumed it was Mr. Wickham returning." Grant's eyes sharpened. "A figure. Man or woman?" "I couldn't say," the Reverend said helplessly. "It was just a dark shape." Miss Marple's gaze drifted again to Mrs. Fletcher's damp glove. Dark shape. A woman in a dark coat? Or merely the shadow of someone in a corridor lined with portraits and bad lighting? Grant exhaled through his nose. "Constable Price," he called. "Come in a moment." The constable entered from the hall, hat still in his hands, eyes wide. "Yes, sir. I want the front and back doors watched. No one leaves the house. And I want the kitchen staff kept where they are. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Price said quickly, and vanished again. Grant's next question was not about the corridor at all. It was about motive. "Who benefits from Mr. Wickham's death?" he asked. There was a collective recoil, as though he had splashed cold water. People liked to gossip about death, but they disliked the crude arithmetic of inheritance. Mrs. Briggs said at once, "Inspector, really? You all knew him," Grant said. "Someone will inherit. Someone will lose. If you wish to help, you'll speak." Mrs. Pritchard's small hands fluttered. "Doesn't it all go to charity?" Mrs. Briggs snorted softly. "Not all. Mr. Wickham had arrangements." Everyone looked, almost against their will, toward the door through which Lily Hart had gone. Miss Marple saw it, the reflexive glance, quick and sharp. Not compassion, calculation. Dr. Finch spoke carefully. "Mr. Wickham had no children. His nearest blood relatives are distant cousins in London, but he kept people close, in various ways. He supported the parish. He funded the surgery's roof repairs. He paid for scholarships. And he employed Lily." Mrs. Briggs leaned forward, eyes bright. "He was very fond of her, you know." "He was fond of many things he wished to possess," Miss Marple murmured, almost inaudibly. Grant's gaze flicked to her. "You think she's in the will?" Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "I think people assume she is. Men and assumptions can be more dangerous than facts." Grant rubbed a hand briefly over his mouth. He had the uneasy sense of a tight web drawn around that quiet study, threads leading into the drawing room, into the village, into 10-year-old whispers. "Dr. Finch," he said, "you mentioned Edmund Carraway was meant to inherit something. If a will existed then and disappeared, then someone benefited," Dr. Finch finished. "And someone might fear that truth coming out now," Grant said. A small sound came from the hall, footsteps, quick and light. The drawing-room door opened, and Lily Hart stood there, pale, breath caught high in her chest. "Inspector," she said, and her voice shook, "I need to speak to you, alone." Grant studied her. "Why?" Lily swallowed. Her eyes flickered, not to Dr. Finch, not to Mrs. Briggs, but to Miss Marple, as though Miss Marple's quiet presence was somehow both comfort and threat. "Because," Lily said, and the words came out in a rush, "I think I know who wrote that letter." The room seemed to contract around them. Even the ticking of the mantel clock sounded louder, as though the house itself were straining to hear. Grant rose slowly. "How would you know that?" Lily's hands clenched at her sides. "Because I saw it," she whispered. "I saw it this morning, on his desk, before he hid it, and Inspector, I didn't tell anyone because I was frightened." "Frightened of whom?" Grant asked. Lily's breath came fast. "Of the person who left something else for him, not just the letter." Grant's eyes narrowed. "Something else?" Lily nodded, and now tears finally spilled, silent and hot. "A clock key," she said. "Ah, the little metal key for winding and stopping the hall clock." It was lying on the paper like a threat. In the hush that followed, Miss Marple's thoughts moved, precise and steady, like a needle threading cloth. A stopped study clock, a fast hall clock, and a key left deliberately where it would be found. Not a tool, a message. And if it was a message, then someone in that room, or someone just beyond it, had wanted Harold Wickham to understand that time itself could be made to lie. The room did not erupt, as such revelations sometimes did. Instead, it went very still, as though everyone were waiting for a clock to strike that refused to cooperate. Inspector Grant was the first to move. He crossed to Lily Hart and guided her gently but firmly toward a chair. "Sit down," he said. "Take a breath. Then tell me exactly what you saw." Lily obeyed, her hands trembling in her lap. "This morning," she said, staring at the carpet as if the pattern might keep her anchored, "I went into Mr. Wickham's study to file some correspondence. He was out walking the grounds. There was a letter on his desk, folded, but not sealed. I know I shouldn't have looked, but it had my name written on the corner. Not addressed to me, just written there. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. Names written where they did not belong were rarely accidental. "What did it say?" Grant asked. Lily swallowed. "I didn't read it all. Only the first line. You think you've buried it, but time remembers." Her voice shook. "It frightened me. I folded it back exactly as it was." "And the clock key," Grant prompted. "It was lying on the top of the letter," Lily said. "The little brass one, the one Mrs. Pemberton keeps in the drawer, but this one wasn't old. It was newer, shinier, as if it had been bought recently." Mrs. Pemberton gasped softly from the doorway of the morning room, where she had been hovering anxiously. "There's only one key," she said. "Only one." Miss Marple spoke gently. "Keys are easily duplicated, dear, especially when one wishes to make a point." Grant nodded. "Did Mr. Wickham mention the letter to you later?" "No," Lily said. "But he was different, distracted. He asked me twice whether the hall clock had been wound. He never asked that. Not like that." Grant's gaze flicked to Dr. Finch. "Did he seem ill at all?" Dr. Finch shook her head. "No. Preoccupied, yes, but not unwell." "Lily," Grant said. "Now, why didn't you tell anyone about the letter?" Lily's hands tightened. "Because of Edmund Carraway." The name fell again into the room, heavy as a dropped book. "He used to speak to me about him," Lily continued more steadily now, as though confession were lending her strength. "Not kindly, as if Edmund were a mistake he'd been forced to tidy away. He once said—" She stopped, then pressed on. "Some people think death ends a matter, but it only delays it." Mrs. Briggs made a small sound, half protest, half fascination. "That doesn't mean—" "No," Grant said, cutting her off. "It doesn't. But it suggests motive." He turned to Dr. Finch. "How did Edmund Carraway die exactly?" Dr. Finch folded her arms. "He fell from the low orchard wall. Drunk, it was said. Broke his neck. There was an inquest. No foul play found. But," Grant said quietly, "no one ever looked very hard." Dr. Finch met his eyes. "Because Mr. Wickham paid for a great many things in this village, and people are inclined not to look hard at the hands that feed them." Miss Marple's voice floated into the pause. "And because Edmund was not liked, people are always relieved when an inconvenient person is removed by misadventure." Grant studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Someone believed Mr. Wickham was responsible, enough to threaten him." "And enough," Dr. Finch added, "to frighten him into coming alone." Grant turned back to Lily. "You said the key was a message." "Yes," Lily said. "Not just a threat, a reminder. That time could be controlled, changed." Grant's mouth tightened. "Or falsified." He rose and paced slowly, yet the way men did when their thoughts needed room. The study clock was stopped at 4:02. The hall clock is fast by several minutes. If someone wanted to create confusion about when Mr. Wickham died, they'd use both. Miss Marple tilted her head. Or if someone wanted Mr. Wickham himself to feel confused, to feel pursued. Grant stopped. "Explain." Miss Marple folded her hands. "The letter summons him to 4:00. The hall clock is fast. He believes it is nearly time when it is not. He goes early. He waits. He grows anxious. Then someone arrives. Someone he is already afraid of." Dr. Finch's eyes widened slightly. "And the study clock is stopped after." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "to suggest the death occurred later, or to fix the moment in a way that cannot argue back." Grant exhaled slowly. "Which means the killer didn't need poison or a weapon. Only fear. Or perhaps a shock." Dr. Finch nodded grimly. "A man with a guilty conscience doesn't need much encouragement." Mrs. Fletcher, who had been very still for several minutes, suddenly spoke. "This is absurd," she said sharply. "You're suggesting he frightened himself to death over a decade-old accident?" Grant turned to her. "I'm suggesting someone knew exactly what would frighten him." Mrs. Fletcher's composure cracked. Edmund Carraway was unstable. He drank. He argued with Mr. Wickham constantly. He threatened him. "And did Mr. Wickham threaten him?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Fletcher's eyes flashed. "I wouldn't know." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I wonder." Grant's gaze sharpened. "Mrs. Fletcher, you were on the parish committee 10 years ago. Not you helped arrange Edmund's stay here?" "Yes," Mrs. Fletcher said stiffly. "And you handled some of the correspondence with the solicitor." Her chin lifted. "I helped, so did others." "Did you ever see a will?" Grant asked. "No," she said quickly. "Never." "Not even a draft?" "No." Miss Marple's eyes drifted again to the glove. Still damp, still twisted. Grant let the silence stretch. Then he said, "Mrs. Fletcher, did you go into the study this afternoon?" "No." "Did you meet Mr. Wickham in the hall?" "No." "Did you touch the hall clock?" Mrs. Fletcher's voice rose. "Of course not." Grant nodded, as though satisfied. Then he turned away, dismissing her with that very satisfaction. It was an old technique, and it worked more often than people liked to admit. He faced the room again. Someone wanted Mr. Wickham frightened. Someone wanted to remind him of Edmund Carraway. Someone wanted to play with time. And someone, Miss Marple added softly, wanted to be seen as that person without actually being them. Grant looked at her sharply. "A deception?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "The key left in plain sight. The stopped clock. These are theatrical gestures. They draw attention. But truly guilty people tend to be economical." Dr. Finch frowned. "Then you think the letter writer and the killer may not be the same?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that the person who frightened Mr. Wickham may have believed they were doing only that." Grant's mind clicked forward, and someone else took advantage. There was a sudden knock at the door, sharp, official. Constable Price entered, face flushed. "Inspector, there's something you should see. Look in the orchard." Grant's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" "A footprint," Price said. "Fresh. By the wall where Mr. Carraway fell, and—" He hesitated. "Someone's been there recently. Very recently." A ripple passed through the room. The past had reached out and left a mark in the present. Grant straightened. "Dr. Finch, come with me. Miss Marple, if you don't mind." Miss Marple rose smoothly. "Of course." As they moved toward the door, Lily's voice came out small but urgent. "Inspector." He paused. "Mr. Wickham," Lily said, "was afraid this afternoon, but not of Edmund." Grant turned. "Who then?" Lily's eyes flicked again, involuntarily, toward Mrs. Fletcher, then away. "Of someone who knew the truth," she whispered, "and who knew how to make time wait." Miss Marple followed Grant into the hall, for her mind already fitting pieces together, not with haste, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who had seen too many lives undone by what people thought they had safely buried. Behind them, the hall clock ticked on, fast, persuasive, and entirely indifferent to the fact that it was now measuring something far more dangerous than minutes. The orchard lay quiet in the late afternoon light, its trees bare-limbed and patient, as though they had seen far worse than a disturbed footprint. Inspector Grant stood by the low stone wall, hands on his hips, studying the shallow impression pressed into the soft earth below. "Not an accident," he said at last. "Someone stood here." "Recently." Dr. Finch nodded. "And not to admire the view." Miss Marple leaned lightly on her walking stick, gazing not at the footprint, but at the wall itself. "People return to places that trouble them," she said, "sometimes to reassure themselves, sometimes to be reassured that nothing has changed." Grant looked at her. "Or sometimes to make sure it hasn't." She smiled faintly. The footprint was narrow, the tread worn. A sensible shoe. Not a man's. Grant straightened. Constable Price. Bring Mrs. Fletcher. Mrs. Fletcher arrived moments later, her composure already fraying. She looked from the wall to the footprint and back again, her mouth tightening. "Have you been out here today?" Grant asked. "No," she said too quickly. "Of course not." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "You came often, though. 10 years ago." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes flashed. "That was different." "Was it?" Miss Marple asked softly. Or does this place always feel unfinished to you?" Grant stepped in before the moment could tip into hysteria. Mrs. Fletcher, Edmund Carroway was meant to inherit Alderwick House. There was a will, a draft at least. "There was no such thing," Mrs. Fletcher snapped. "There was," Dr. Finch said quietly. "I remember Edmund speaking of it. He was hopeful, for the first time in his life." Mrs. Fletcher laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Hopeful? He was reckless. He threatened Harold. He said he'd expose him. Ruin him." "And did he?" Grant asked. "No," she said sharply, "because he fell." Silence closed around them. Grant's voice was very calm. "You helped Harold Wickham with his affairs. You handled correspondence. You were there when Edmund argued with him, and when Edmund died, the will vanished." Mrs. Fletcher's breath came fast. You can't prove that." "No," Grant agreed. "But someone knew enough to threaten Harold with it. Someone who understood how frightened he'd be. Someone who knew about the clocks." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes darted. "Clocks," Miss Marple said gently. "You've always been particular about time. You're never late. You hate waiting. And yet you were the one who paused in the West Hall, who washed her hands, who handled water." Mrs. Fletcher stared at her. "You silly old woman." Miss Marple did not flinch. "You stopped the study clock after Harold collapsed. You wanted it to look as though he died later, after 4. You knew people would trust the clock. You always do." Grant nodded. "But you didn't kill him." Mrs. Fletcher froze. "You frightened him," Grant continued. "You wrote the letter. You left the clock key. And you meant to confront him, to make him admit what he did. Perhaps you wanted him to suffer." Mrs. Fletcher's face crumpled just a little. "He deserved to." "But you didn't mean for him to die," Grant said. "You left him alone in that study, and someone else went in after you." Mrs. Fletcher whispered. "Who?" Grant turned. Dr. Finch closed her eyes. Lily Hart stood a little apart, her face pale but steady now. "It was me," she said. No one spoke. "I didn't mean to kill him," Lily went on. "I truly didn't. But when I heard what he'd done, what he'd taken from Edmund, I couldn't bear it. He used people. He used me. And when I saw him there, so frightened, so small," her voice broke. "I told him Edmund's death wasn't finished with him, that some things don't end when we decide they should." He clutched his chest. He tried to speak. I thought—" She shook her head. "I thought he was pretending." Dr. Finch stepped forward. "You frightened him into a fatal collapse." "Yes," Lily said. "And when I realized he was dying, I panicked. I didn't touch the clocks. I didn't touch anything. I just ran." Grant exhaled slowly. Mrs. Fletcher set the stage. "You delivered the final blow." Mrs. Fletcher sank against the wall, covering her face. "I only wanted the truth known." Miss Marple spoke softly, almost kindly. "Truth is a dangerous thing when it's handled like a weapon." The house was very quiet when they returned. The constable led Lily away gently. Mrs. Fletcher followed soon after. Subdued, the sharpness drained from her at last. Inspector Grant stood in the hall looking at the clock. "It's strange," he said. "All that trouble for a few minutes gained or lost." Miss Marple smiled. "Time is very persuasive, Inspector. People believe it tells the truth because it keeps moving forward." "And yet," Grant said, "it was lying the whole afternoon." Yes, Miss Marple replied, but only because people asked it too. Later, when Alderwick House had been emptied of scandal and authority alike, Miss Marple sat once more by the window, her knitting returned to her hands. The clock ticked steadily now, corrected, modest, no longer fast. Dr. Finch poured her a cup of tea. "You saw it early," she said. "Didn't you?" Miss Marple considered. "I saw that Harold Wickham was a man who believed he could arrange outcomes, and that such men are often undone by those they underestimate." The clocks. "A flourish," Miss Marple said. "The real danger was memory. Edmund Carroway was not forgotten. He was merely waiting." Dr. Finch looked out at the village, already resuming its habits. "Do you think it will change anything?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Villages rarely change. They only learn, briefly." She glanced at the clock one last time, listening to its honest, unhurried ticking. "After all," she added, "time always tells the truth eventually, even when people teach it to whisper lies."